we found out this morning that both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss will also vote against that deal. This after the Eurosceptic group of MPs, as part of the European Research Group, the ERG, issued their report yesterday, giving, well, a pretty damning indictment of this new measure. Well, let's talk to the leader of that group, Conservative MP Mark Francois now. Good morning to you, Mark.
Good morning, Jeanette.
Thank you very much for joining us. We know there's another meeting this morning. You've only had that report since yesterday from your Star Chamber of Legal Experts. Spoke to one of them earlier, Martin Howe, KC. It was pretty damning. Basically, not only is this not an improvement on the Northern Ireland Protocol as it stands right now, it probably makes things worse than before. So can you confirm to me right now whether you will or you won't vote for this deal today?
Gillian, I can announce on your show, I personally will vote against it. Although I can't speak for the whole of the group because we haven't had our meeting yet, just to be clear. But I, as chairman of the group, will vote against it. The problem with the Stormont brake, in a nutshell, is it's a brake with no brake pads. It's so complicated. I wish we had the time to go through it stage by stage, but suffice to say, there can be up to 9 stages involved in the process. And it's been written deliberately never to be used. There are so many caveats in it. The government basically described it as a veto. It's not actually a veto, and it is so complicated that practically I suspect it will never ever be used.
And indeed, if it were used, the European Union has the right to retaliate and to effectively punish us for using that brake.
That is absolutely correct, and it's worse than that. Because even if you pull it and you get it, it still has to go ultimately to arbitration if the EU say they still object, and you could lose the arbitration. So if most people, when you use the word veto, they basically, in simple English, it means if you want to do something and I don't want you to do it and I veto it, it can't happen. This is not a veto.
Yeah. OK, now the argument for Rishi Sunak is that we need to get back to good terms with the EU. People like me would say, look, you know, if the small print matches the rhetoric, yeah, this sounds great. But speaking to other members, Craig McKinley of your group, the ERG, it does appear even with the green lanes and the red lanes, there's an awful lot of paperwork for the green lanes. It's not what we thought, which was like, yeah, people can just carry on that trade. We're kind of going to get rid of that customs barrier and that hard trade border down the Irish Sea. Doesn't appear to be the case. Has Rishi Sunak lied to us about what that deal contains?
I'm not going to call the Prime Minister a liar. I don't think he is a liar. But I think some people around him have massively overspun what this deal actually represents. I mean, you mentioned the green lanes. Most people think of a green lane, you get off your plane at the airport, the green lane you walk through, the customs guy can say, well, can I have a look in your bag? But basically you walk through a green lane. For this green lane, you've got to fill in a form with 21 fields of information, even before you get in the lane. Yeah. To most people, that is not, we can argue what the colour is, but it's not
that's certainly not the impression we were getting. Look, you've got...
Julia, sorry, as you know in life, there's an old saying, always read the small print.
Yeah. Well, you've got only about 40 members of your group. The Prime Minister's got a working majority now of about 67. You've got DUP's 10 members voting against. We know Boris Johnson, we know Liz Truss said they're going to vote against. We know people like David Davis is going to vote for, the former Brexit Secretary. Realistically, with Labour saying they are going to vote through this measure, the Prime Minister's going to win this. This measure is going to be, the law. This is what's going to go through. What do you do next?
Well, I think it's, by the way, Ian Duncan Smith has come out this morning and said he's going to vote against it. So that's 3 former leaders of the Conservative Party who are all going to vote against this deal. We know that ultimately the government will win today because the Labour Party are supporting them. But this thing is growing in terms of its opposition as we speak. And what's really fundamental, whatever the result is in the Commons this afternoon, is that the DUP have said no. The whole point of this was to come up with a deal to underpin and support the Good Friday Agreement, one the DUP could support, and then return to power sharing in Stormont. whatever the numbers today, the fact that DUP feel they have to vote against this thing because it doesn't really put right the balance in Northern Ireland, I think shows that our negotiators simply didn't do a good enough job.
Yeah, I mean, this is the key thing, isn't it? It's, you know, if this was the whole point, to get power sharing back up, and of course we know that a lot of the impetus was this 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement coming up in April, and American President Joe Biden wanted to come over and mark this. That real pressure from everyone, like, get a deal. This'll do, let's get it through. But of course it's the people of Northern Ireland who live with this forever. A lot of people will say, you know what? We need to move on. That's the best we're going to do. We just want to get back to good relations with the EU and move on in the future. But there is a concern for this also about people in Great Britain as well. So even if people say, well, I don't care about Northern Ireland, and a lot of people do say that. But even then, if living in Britain, there is a real concern about this ties the Northern Ireland into not just EU laws now, but forever in the future. But to maintain no proper hard border, although it is a semi-hard border between us and the Irish Sea, that would mean no changes in the rules in the rest of the UK as well. It's basically is a very, very slippery slope to tying us into EU rules forever, in which case, what was the point of Brexit?
Well, the point of Brexit was that we legally left the European Union. But there is, if you like, Julia, this bit of unfinished business with regards to Northern Ireland. And we hope that in these negotiations, you know, our negotiators would take a very robust stance. They would come up with something that we could all support, including the DUP. Ultimately, this is about supporting and upholding the Good Friday Agreement. And that relies on cross-community support. It always has done. It relies on the principle of consent for both traditions in Northern Ireland. That's why we had to do something about the protocol. Everybody, you know, we won that argument. The problem is, unfortunately, this deal doesn't really go far enough. What we should do is not abandon the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, because we have the powers in that bill in order to fully restore the place of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom. To already have given away our best weapon, in my opinion, and that of many of my colleagues, is a fundamental mistake.
OK, thank you for that. The other big event happening today, of course, is Boris Johnson giving evidence to the Privileged Committee. I want to ask you about that. In the last few moments, the Privileged Committee has published their evidence bundle. It's online, 170 pages. Can't read it all while I'm on air, obviously, wanting to interview and listen to you, what you have to say. But we saw Boris Johnson's dossier yesterday. He has admitted, yes, he did mislead Parliament over parties in Parliament. We also know, of course, that, of course, there were police fines. We know that some of those parties broke the rules. Otherwise, people wouldn't have been fined and wouldn't have paid those fines, including the Prime Minister and, of course, on one occasion, Rishi Sunak as well. But he says he did not intentionally or recklessly mislead Parliament. He corrected the record at the earliest opportunity. Do you believe that he has intentionally or recklessly misled Parliament?
Well, Julia, I talked about reading the small print earlier. I haven't had the opportunity to read through all the pages and pages of Boris's evidence, and I certainly haven't had the opportunity to read through the Privileges Committee's bundle of evidence, because I've been too busy reading through all this Euro gobbledygook to do with the framework agreement. So forgive me if you think I've not been diligent enough, but yeah, I've had my head buried in these Euro documents for the last couple of weeks.
Okay.
So I'm not going to preempt what happens at the inquiry, but what I think is fair to say is that, you know, Boris Johnson, we all know him. He's a pretty feisty character, and I'm sure he will give a good account of himself. And then
look, looking at all the evidence, and absolutely, this isn't a.
Julia, sorry, I'm not trying to be evasive.
No, I completely understand. I understand that. Look, I want them to look at all the evidence, and this is a serious event. It can affect his future political career, and it should be done fairly. He says it's not a fair process already. However, I would just say to you simply, I was in work all that time. I knew you weren't allowed to have parties. We were told you weren't allowed to have parties. You weren't even allowed to be in your garden with more than one other person for some of that time. On the night they had a party where it was bring your own booze party, organised by the Prime Minister's own senior principal private secretary. Invitation went out to 100 people on email. Only 30 turned up, but there was certainly a lot of booze, and there was certainly a party at a time when I wasn't allowed to have anyone in my garden. You weren't allowed to have anyone in your garden. No one was allowed to have any social events whatsoever in their workplace. How come I knew the law and millions of other people in this country knew the law, including people working in offices, but the Prime Minister who made the law didn't know the law?
Do you know, I have a funny feeling that the Privileges Committee are going to be making all of these points later this afternoon. I'm not going to second guess what they're going to say.
Did you know the law?
I think we all did, but one of the problems,
and as I say,
Boris can speak for himself, but I think one of the problems is, and I'm sure this will come out in the inquiry, in the hearing this afternoon, is that what didn't make it any easier is that the rules kept changing. Now, you know my voting record. I was, if for want of a better term, a lockdown skeptic. I accepted we had to have a brief lockdown in order to try and get the virus under control. But I was one of those people who voted consistently because against ever greater measures, because I felt that, you know, perhaps those measures were left in place for that bit too long, and that had very damaging effects economically and also in terms of mental health. So that's kind of the angle that I was coming at.
I'm not going to get more from you. I know that. Look, I really appreciate you joining us. You've confirmed, of course, you will be voting against the Windsor Framework, the Stormont break, and that vote later today.